Yeah, so how do we make ourselves safer? It's exactly what we're focusing on this morning, on lawlessness in our country. We've seen how some areas have basically, and these are the words from people we've spoken to in some of these areas, turning into the Wild West. Just this weekend, very sad, we saw more than 20 people lose their lives when suspects opened fire on them in taverns in both Soweto and Pietermaritzburg. Guns are predominantly the weapon of choice for criminals, of course, but it's the issue of gun control laws that is hugely divisive. Well, let's bring in firearm law expert Martin Hood to join us and talk about this. Martin, good to have you on eNCA again. Always a pleasure speaking to you. So the moment this happened, we all knew that those who are anti-gun are going to say we need tighter restrictions. I suppose there's an argument, though, isn't there? You can tighten the restrictions, but criminals aren't getting legal firearms. These are all illegal firearms already, aren't they?
Gareth, you're absolutely correct, but somewhat ironically, the anti-gun side is actually saying exactly what we've been saying for a long, long time, and that is we need to look not at the amendment of laws, but actually the enforcement of existing laws. We have a major breakdown in the administration of firearms by the South African police. Just to give one example, the South African police in 2004 was supposed to have a digitized system to control the distribution and movement of firearms, legal firearms. We now sit in 2022. We have 3 court orders against the police, plus a pending contempt of court order against the Minister of Police and the National Commissioner to implement the system. So you can point squarely at the police themselves and say it's your fault because you have not put in place what the Firearms Control Act mandated back in 2004. And the consequence of that, and this is very, very important, there are two fundamental consequences. The first, quite simply, is that the police don't know who's got firearms and where. And when it comes to recovery of firearms in the hands of criminals, they can't convict those criminals because the records of the Central Firearms Registry are so poor that they can't prove beyond reasonable doubt that that criminal actually should or should not have had that firearm in their possession. So we have a crisis on our hands. It's as simple as that.
So you would say that the police minister has failed in his duty to protect South Africans?
I think that successive police ministers and successive national commissioners have failed in their duty to protect South Africans. The Firearms Control Act, when it went through the parliamentary process, was touted as a key element of crime prevention and crime control in South Africa, and it has dismally failed. And I want to emphasize that law-abiding firearm owners have done everything within their power to try and comply with the requirements of the Firearms Control Act. But it's very difficult to comply when the administration has broken down. And I also want to emphasize that with the Tavern shooting in Soweto, I believe that approximately 130 AK-47 cases were picked up at the scene. Those are not firearms that are generally available to civilians. They're what's called a restricted firearm, and it's very difficult for a civilian to get a license for such a firearm. So we have to ask ourselves the question, where do these firearms come from? Have the police failed to remove firearms that go back before 1994 from the hands of criminals? And then we also have to bear in mind as well that the South African police themselves were instrumental in losing anything between 2,500 and 10,000 firearms through Colonel Chris Prinsloo, who sold those firearms into the Cape Flats. And I can also tell you that I'm personally involved in 2 investigations where amnesty firearms, a large number of amnesty firearms, have been stolen from police custody. So we have a fundamental problem that revolves around the conduct of the police themselves.
And there's also the issue as well, and I suppose there's a sense of irony in this when you talk about lawlessness and safety of citizens, Martin, is when you hear stories, and we've reported on them, I'm sure you know about them, when police stations themselves are being robbed at gunpoint and guns are being stolen from police stations itself. It's almost laughable if it wasn't so serious.
Well, let's take it one step further. Not only is it serious, but I can also say, again, because of personal experience, that the police themselves interfere in such investigations. In other words, they try and stop such investigations, or they actually try and conceal investigations into their conduct. And again, that just goes back to the crisis that the South African police services are currently experiencing. It's been a long time in coming. It's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I can tell you that it is really at its worst ever, both in terms of the ability of the police to police firearms and the ability of the police to administer firearms.
In the final question that I have for you, Martin, we've spoken about the problems here. It can come across as quite doom and gloom, and that's not to put any veneer over it. It's very serious. Where to from here? What do we try and do? Because there's a lot to try and fix. Where would Martin Hood start?
Well, the two simple things that need to be done. The first is that we need to get the electronic or digitized system in place as quickly as possible. There's a court order that said it had to be done by 30 September last year. The police haven't even issued a tender yet. And then the second is that they need to talk to the industry, particularly firearm dealers. They are a cornerstone of the administration of the legislation. They are a key interface between the police and the public. And there has been absolutely no contact, no consultation, no attempt by the police to engage us to deal with the problems, which the police know about these problems. I personally met with the Secretary of Police and the Secretariat of Police. I've made presentations to the Portfolio Committee on Policing on numerous occasions where time and time again, they have all been told about the problems within the Central Firearms Registry, and yet nothing gets done. Put the system in place, talk to the industry.
That sounds so simple, isn't it? But this is South Africa. It might not be as easy as that. But Martin, thank you very much. I hope those that make these decisions have been listening to what you've been saying. Martin Hood, firearms expert, joining us here on eNCA. I'm sure we'll get Martin back on very soon as we continue to look at lawlessness as our focus here on eNCA.